Now I'd like to introduce IPSR Director, Dr. Matt Grossman.
Thanks so much for being here to talk about what the census means for Michigan and all of the implications that the new results will have for our state. I've also been tasked with reminding you of a few things IPSR related. First, the Michigan Political Leadership Program is now accepting applications if you want to take the next step to be more involved in politics or potentially run for office. Go to mplp.msu.edu through the end of this month. It's a traveling 10-weekend program that helps develop potential candidates and leaders throughout the state. We also have upcoming forums in October, November, and December that you'll be able to sign up for soon. Those include coverage of student learning loss during the pandemic and efforts to remedy it, as well as a review of business tax incentives that the state uses. We'll also have a forum related to this one that we've co-sponsored from Close-Up at the University of Michigan on communities of interest and the state's new redistricting commission. You can go to ippsr.msu.edu to learn more about any of those forums and opportunities. Now we're pleased to start the panel off with Carrie Ebersole Singh, who was the statewide census director for 2020. Carrie?
Good afternoon. I had to take a quick look at my clock to ensure it was indeed afternoon. It's so wonderful to be with you all, and thank you, IPSR, for sponsoring this dialogue, because a lot of times people forget about the census when it's over. And I think it's one thing that's so important to our state and impacts so many critical services and important issues like redistricting, as you just mentioned. It's important for us to continue to talk about the importance of the decennial census. So just a little bit about my role on behalf of the governor and our state complete count committee. You know, we had an amazing committee that was appointed all in service to promote the importance of the statewide census and that folks complete that form. I think it's important to start this discussion on the challenges leading in to the 2020 census. And so I'm going to take you back at least to the year 2019, prior to the pandemic. I know for many of us, it's hard to remember beyond this last year. But back in 2019, you know, the US Census Bureau conducts a survey before any census to get a feel of how responses will go. Those results came back with some critical findings preparing for that 2020 census, one of which is a lot of folks across the country didn't know there was a census coming up, didn't realize how the census impacted their lives and the state and their communities. And also preparing for our first online census. That's right, this was our first online census. So it was a new set of ways that the census was going to be conducted. So those were a number of items that were found, you know, a year in, you know, but prior to the census actually started. I think the other thing too, there was a lot of concerns that some of the announcements from the Trump administration that folks were concerned either by filling out the census, the accuracy of the census, what the census you know, information would actually be used for. So there was a lot of uncertainty when you think back to 2019 and looking ahead to that 2020 census. A couple other items that I just want to mention briefly, challenges to the census, because I think it's important when we look at the work that was reflected here. You know, obviously, if you remember back, I believe the census form went public. The online portal to fill out the census went public, I believe, in March 12th. And I think just a few days after, March 14th is ringing a bell, is when the restrictions and recommendations in terms of the coronavirus outbreak and how we should be mindful of, masking and limiting outdoor activities outside the household. So just wanted to put that timeline out there because it really presented a number of challenges. And then because of the pandemic, the U.S. Census Bureau had to adopt new timelines that created some uncertainty, but also changed the timeline for critical operations to ensure that everyone would be counted. So that was another kind of changing dynamic, and eventually they did extend that timeline that concluded on October 15th. So I just wanted to start there to ensure that we outline some of the challenges. I think one that I have not mentioned, of course, is the number of hard to count communities across our state, across the country. There were estimated about 1.8 million residents were estimated to be hard to count. And we measured that by census tracts, between income and poverty areas, low access to the internet, and other challenges that were expected to depress or be challenging to get folks counted. So just wanted to highlight that, all the challenges. Now, I'm going to point to some success here, recognizing all those dynamics, and I'm going to share my screen briefly here. And let's see. Survey says, so here's some good news. So 71%, over 71% of Michigan households self-responded to the 2020 census. And we talk about self-responded rates, and that means that essentially those are the folks that didn't need any additional prompting, or they may have gotten some additional prompting, but that they self-responded. So no one had to come to their
Terry,
door.
we lost the graphic. We lost that.
Oops. Apologies for that.
But just seeing your blue screen now.
There you go. Is that better?
Yep. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Arnold. So 71.3%, again, self-responded. So that means no one had to come to a household, to that household to get the response to the census. That left us 8th best in the country as our self-response. And this was critical to the overall strategy to our census efforts. We know that the most accurate count comes from those that self-responded. So we were excited to be again in the top 10 of the country, but of course for us competitive folks, we were bummed out. We couldn't quite catch Minnesota once again, but we got a few years to prepare for the next census. So this is a summary of some of the activities that we did. We obviously did a large scale media campaign across all venues, TV, cable, social, and digital media. We tried our best to get folks to go directly to that census form to complete it. We also did a number of other unique outreach that included text messaging, that again, we wanted to meet people where they are. And even in areas with low broadband access, you still have a number of folks that are carrying a lot of cell phones that give them access to the World Wide Web or the digital online form. So just wanted to point to some of the success pieces there. I'm going to stop sharing this. Oops. I got my double screen going here. So wanted to point to some of those successes. And this is, again, this was our best performance across the state since 1990. And that recognizing the challenges is, I think, pretty profound. We also, our state's 2% increase in population based on the census data will have a huge positive impact and will benefit Michiganders. You heard us talking a lot through our ad campaign and our outreach to various communities through networks that were appointed to the Complete Count Committee. We wanted to ensure that folks understood the importance of the census. Yes, the census in our population is the foundation to our democracy and redistricting and representation in our government. But also, thanks to a study that we often recognize was there's over $30 billion on an annual basis that would come in to help support a number of services, whether that's our libraries to a number of food programs and healthcare benefits across the state. So we kept referencing $30 billion annually, which equated to, of course, roughly $3,000 or $3,000 per person every year for a decade. So yes, that's $30,000. And if you look at just rough map, looking at our population increasing by 2%, where we ended up at the end of the census, that could, that roughly equates to another 250 million annually every year through the 2030 census. So just want to reference some of those items that we landed, beyond our census, our census performance, if you will, or our self-response rate. So the reasons, the lists were long. I think some of the other, outside of the ad campaign, I mentioned roughly some of the partnerships, which were key to us generating this outcome for the state of Michigan. One of which is we had a very close partnership with the Michigan Municipal League Foundation, which worked with communities across the state and functioned as a grant maker. And it was a data-based grant making system for communities with hard to count communities. This could have been also a township or a county, but as we identified those areas, the Michigan Municipal League Foundation was able to offer financial support to those local complete count committees to run locally driven campaigns. It's one way we were able to support the city of Detroit in their efforts. But we saw some really innovative things, especially given the pandemic, recognizing that, while we were looking to do a heavy door-to-door operation, even outside of the census workers, recognizing the pandemic, we had to change and innovate. And some of the fun things that were cultivated down the stretch were, ways that not only phone banking by volunteers, where local communities, generated those volunteers to participate in that. But as restrictions loosened up a bit through the summer, we had food truck rallies in specific neighborhoods or low performing census tracts that were hard to count. We did those types of event based tactics to get to folks and again promote some of promote the importance of completing the census. So I was going to start referencing some of the innovative things Vicki did, but I will leave that for her talking points here shortly. I know we're going to move on to the next speaker, but I think at the end of the day, and I know there's a number of communities across the state that have concerns with the accuracy of their count, with incredibly well-supported reason. It was a challenging census because of the pandemic, because of the hard to reach communities across our state. And, I'm looking forward to see how these items play out, to see if we're able to make up some of those potential folks that we unfortunately did not get to complete the census. So with that, I'm assuming that Matt is going to introduce our next panelists.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that introduction to the effort, and I think we're going to learn a little bit more about its implications now with the Department Chair of Political Science at Michigan State University, Corey Smith.
All right, thank you, Matt. It's nice to be here virtually. I see some students and attendees, or former students and attendees, which I wish I could say hi to. I will be sharing my screen, hopefully. Let's see here. There we go. That's the. Let's start over. All right. Assuming that everyone can see that, I will talk about what. There we go. I got a thumbs up from Matt. Very good. I was tasked with giving a little brief preview of what's going on with redistricting, and because of the census and the early results we have now, not all the results are in terms of what would be impactful for the census redistricting commission. I mean, I am not going to try to comment on what's going on with the Independent Redistricting Commission right now. There's a lot of what ifs going on and some draft maps that will likely change. So what we're going to try to do is examine the political implications through the lens of counties and existing districts, knowing how the current districts and counties would have to change, or understanding politics through those districts. Then I'll wrap up briefly by discussing some difficulties of applying this cycle census data for redistricting this year, in terms of what's different this year and this cycle compared to previous cycles. And I'll save all comments for independent commission and what's going on right now for the panel at the end. Briefly, I assume I'm kind of charged with being the maps person for this presentation a little bit. The U.S. population grew, but by 7.4%, Michigan grew by 2%. In terms of apportionment, though, and distributing of seats, this growth was a little more even this time. In 2020, 6 states gained and 7 states lost a total of 7 seats in the U.S. House. In 2020, when you compare that to 2010 or past years, that's actually a low number. For instance, 2010, 8 states gained and 10 states lost a total of 12 seats in 2010. So population change is actually from state to state is not as great as it used to be. Michigan did add residents, 2% change, but we ranked 46th in growth. And that meant we lost a seat for the US House from 14 to 13. And that's our 5th successive decade of losing a seat. Now, there is one glimmer of hope in there. So if you go, are we going to keep on losing seats? This year, this time, Michigan ranked 9th among states next in line to receive an additional seat. So whereas in the past, Michigan was always near the bottom and sort of the next likely state to lose a seat, this time we're kind of ranked near the top. So it'll be a lot harder for us to lose a seat next cycle, based even on sort of 2% change and sort of growth at a rate of like in the 46th or the 40th rank area of growth. So there might be some stability in how House districts are allocated, at least with Michigan in the next cycle. Now, there are a lot of implications to the census that have to do with finances and local politics. I'm not going to cover those. I was tasked with looking at sort of representation and redistricting. I think, though, that given the news cycle, it's really easy to get a sort of incorrect picture of what's happening. So I'm going to just try to emphasize 2 principles. One is that marginals matter more. So I'm going with the the triple alliteration trend of political slogans lately. And that is that even though demographic trends are sort of what the news media like to cover, Ottawa County, fastest growing county in Michigan, the marginals still matter the most when it comes to representation. And the second thing that we need to understand is that political trends are very, very weak. They can easily be reversed with one candidate. Now, I have one graph that's a little it's not the best way of showing this, but I really didn't have a better way of understanding this. I just want to emphasize two features here. So this on the y-axis is the county population change from 2010 to 2020, where the arrow shows where each county is going. I provided some text of certain counties that stick out. And then on the x-axis is the split in the presidential, two-party presidential vote in these counties, comparing 2012 to 2020. So while there is a lot of talk right now in response to the census about how certain counties are growing and certain counties are shrinking, for instance, Ottawa County being the fastest county in terms of percent change, it's also true that Oakland County grew as a higher total number. And that even though the percent change is very interesting to sort of understand what places are changing a lot, when we get to representation, what matters is the total count. And based on the total count, Oakland actually gained a greater share of political power than Ottawa. Likewise, whereas people talk about Wayne County or Detroit losing population and declining, it's important to recognize that Wayne County overall population decline, relative to other counties is smaller, but it's still very much the largest county in the state. Now, another thing that you need to understand here is if you compare sort of the y-axis, the shifts on the y-axis and the shifts on the x-axis, you'll see that there's a lot more change left to right than up and down. And that's because political changes from over 8 years are a lot more variable and a lot noisier than demographic changes. So demographic trends are much stickier. Political changes, back in 2014, during the 2010 gubernatorial election, a lot of these counties that have now trended Democrat actually trended Republican from 2008 to 2010. And so when we're looking at trends, they're only as consistent as the parties are consistent. And if parties, and Michigan has seen a recent change in sort of how party alignments exist in the state, we can't really sort of predict what will be the political consequences much further than maybe 2 years or 4 years, depending on who the candidates will be. And I'd also like to point out that there's a lot of this is not based on the census data. This is actually based on the total number of voters in each county. And this is using ACS college education data. There's a lot of discussion about which counties are trending Republican and Democrat, and there's sort of the demographics or destiny argument. Truthfully, it is true that of the counties that are sort of trending Democrat, those tend to be the more educated counties and the ones that tend to be more likely to see economic and population growth in the next few years. But it's also true that when you count up these counties and you look at those that are trending Republican and those that are trending Democrat, it's about equal. So although Wayne County might be shrinking in size, it's very, very large. And you look at the total number of voters, the trends on both sides are kind of even. Indeed, sort of what's really clear is that the counties that are swinging, that is, they're sort of going back and forth in their party support, tend to be the largest chunk of the state. Looking at sort of which U.S. House districts first, we can sort of try to understand which districts and which areas will be most impacted by the results of the census by looking at the current districts and understanding which ones will need the most increase in size of population. In the past, so currently, for the next cycle, each district will have to have a population of 775,000 of some sort. And since we're going from 14 to 13 districts, every district's going to need an increase in population. But which ones are going to need a greater increase in population? And you can see that at the bottom there, it's the districts within Detroit and that contain Flint that have seen the greatest decline in population and will need the greatest increase in population going forward. Not to say that the commission will just use the existing districts and sort of modify them, but if you're looking at this from the lens of a candidate, Kildee is going to have to somehow introduce himself to 100,000 new voters, at least 100,000 new voters, if he were to run again in 2022. Tlaib would have to similarly introduce herself to at least approximately 100,000 new voters. And on contrast, Huizinga or Haley Stevens, which, Haley Stevens' district is a little probably more under threat because that district borders sort of these low population districts like Tlaib's and Lawrence's. Huizinga, Meyer, Stevens, their district doesn't need to really be changed that much in order to get a sufficient number of population. So if you were looking at it from which district could be cut away, the Kildee district would be the one on that sense. However, that is not how the Independent Districting Commission is looking at it. They'll be looking at a different lens. But either way, as a politician, you would have to be saying to yourself, these are the sort of the minimum number of new voters you're gonna have to introduce yourself to. On average, Republican representatives need a larger district by 50,000, whereas Democratic representatives need a larger district by an average of 60,000. But when you look at the state Senate, those trends aren't actually the same for the parties. So this is from redistrictingnew.org. This map in orange shows state Senate districts, current state Senate districts that are below the necessary population average for a state Senate district for our 38 Senate districts. And the green ones are those state Senate districts that are larger than what we currently need for a state Senate district. And as you can see, there's sort of this I-96 corridor. And in fact, when you sort of average this out, both parties kind of equally benefit or equally hurt from population shifts within the state Senate allocation. Democratic held areas grew slightly more relative to Republican areas, in fact. But this growth along the I-96 corridor is kind of, so basically there's a few more Democratic suburban districts along this area than there are Republican suburban districts along this area of growth. But Democratic losses in Detroit and Flint urban areas were more severe, whereas Republican losses weren't as severe, but more typical in northern rural areas. So if you look at the current Senate district changes in terms of population, current population for the current Senate districts and what's allowable, the first three of the first four representatives who are near the inner Detroit area see some of the biggest sort of are the ones hardest hit and would need to introduce themselves to the most amount of voters. Ananich and Flint is clearly the hardest hit district. Now that center line there is the typical what would be average if we average out the population by Senate districts, and the two solid vertical lines are what's within the allowable tolerance. And you can see that, so there are four Democratic districts, held districts, that are sort of the most needing in change, but on average, Republicans are actually more likely to be in seats that need an increase in population than Democrats. So when you actually balance it out, although there are some severely hard hit areas that will need some change that are associated with Democratic held areas, on average, Republicans and Democrats are about the same. And in fact, Democratic areas seen slightly greater increase in power or in voting power relative to Republicans. So just to summarize sort of these trends without getting into how we might look at the data and sort of understand how to use the new initiative or the new constitutional amendment for redistricting, I just want to emphasize that demography matters, but it's not destiny in politics. That is, there is a lot of change in politics. When we sort of try to say what's a safe seat, it seemed like the seat that Slotkin currently holds would have been a safe Republican seat in 2010 or 2012. And that no longer ended up being the case. When we sort of analyze the effect of the census for politics, it's good to have a 2 or 4 year window, not necessarily the whole 10-year cycle. In the near future, Michigan's lost U.S. House seat was most likely to impact a Democrat in terms of a representative. But it's not necessarily the case that So it will be a little harder for the redistricting commission to make the House delegation get close to sort of the overall presidential vote for the state. But just in general, though, population shifts do not clearly favor a party in state politics. Democrats have represented areas with the biggest losses, but Republican regions on average have lost more. With that noted, I'm just going to quickly, though, emphasize a couple features to the census that are maybe throw a wrench in sort of how the redistricting commission and how is trying to use the data, and also how it might, how successful it might be in implementing the data. These are sort of differential privacy and the change in the race item in the census. So the differential privacy aspect is sort of a new tactic by the census to try to limit targeting using micro, highly local data. For instance, in Michigan, auto insurance was always a theme that depending on what 9-digit zip code you had, auto insurers would use the census data to have discriminatory pricing regimes, and depending on what census, what minute sort of census area you lived in. Differential privacy was enacted by the census to sort of limit the ability for people to be targeted within low population areas. And what they did is, what essentially the census did is they added noise to minute census tracts and blocks. And by adding noise, what they did is they added error, where the error on average evens out, so that when you total Detroit or you total Grand Rapids population looks what Grand Rapids population actually is counted by the census. But when you go down to the census block or the tract level, those blocks and tracts have noise in them where certain numbers have been taken out of one tract and added to another, so that certain areas and neighborhoods within a city can't be targeted. This is great for certain policies like maybe auto insurance, but it has created sort of a concern with redistricting and ability to sort of target and adequately identify where people, communities of interest, certain racial, economic groups exist and live. And this has been one area where the states have sort of contested with the census about how accurate the data is and their ability to draw maps that will reflect these communities of interest. That case with Alabama dropped because the census revisited and said that we'll add less noise. There's still some areas, though, where I would argue that there's clearly some noise in, and the data is not correct. But they're just randomly a couple few of these I'd point to. Finally, I'll just briefly talk on another issue that we need to recognize, and that is minority representation redistricting in the census in terms of the Voting Rights Act. Now, when we redistrict in Michigan, we have a certain number of seats, both at the US House and the state Senate and state House, that are what we might refer to as minority opportunity districts. And these are districts in which minority voters are likely to elect the candidate of their choice. That is, either they are sufficiently large size of the population in which the candidate that the minority group votes for is also the candidate that wins. Typically in the past, the state of Michigan has used majority-minority districts as the way of implementing that policy. That is, to have 80 to 70 to 80% African American population within one district to ensure that an African American representative was elected. As some of you might know, that it has been contested as also partisan gerrymandering, in the sense that it packs Democrats all into one district. Recently, advisor to the Independent Redistricting Commission, I looked at past census data and identified separate thresholds in counties based on past data to say that in Oakland County, for instance, if 40% of the district is of the minority, a certain minority voting population, then that is sufficient for a representative to a candidate of their choice to win the election. Also that, 35% in Genesee, so on. These are sort of the recommendations. The one issue, though, that we have to recognize is that the census has actually changed how it measures race. So the analysis in the past that uses 40% or 35% African American to identify what districts will have that now is slightly different. The census made it easier for respondents to select multiple races. And what we found in Michigan is the white population has declined, the black population has stayed even, but what has really increased the most is people selecting multiple races. And so the concern that we're going to have going forward is whether those thresholds that were used in past data are actually going to be accurate, used accurately to identify the correct thresholds going in using the new census form data. So that might be one concern when we're looking at majority minority districts in the future and minority representation. And that's kind of my laundry list there. So I hope I gave you enough to talk about, but I'll return and look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much. And as a reminder, you can input your questions either in the chat or the Q&A function, and we will be getting to them. But now I want to introduce Victoria Kovari, who was appointed by Mayor Duggan as the Executive Director of the Detroit 2020 Census Campaign and had served as manager of the Department of Neighborhoods in the city of Detroit to talk about Detroit's efforts and continuing efforts to get the population count right.
Thanks, Matt. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope to run through this fairly quickly, but wanted to give you a sense of where we stand now in terms of our population and how we got there how we got to the through the census with the campaign we ran, and then what are the next steps for Detroit. And I want to share my screen here. So let's see. I can start the slideshow. Of course, my bar on top is blocking it. So here we go. Here we go. All right. Okay. So this is, so our campaign was called Be Counted Detroit. And when we look at the areas where, what actually was the result of the census. So we look at the area of the population count. So the final census numbers for Detroit were 639,000 people. This was 10% lower than in 2010. And although in 2010, our population loss was 25%, obviously it's an improvement, but it is certainly not what we expected the numbers to be. For instance, the 2019 population estimate that the census did for Detroit was nearly 670,000. It's actually 667,000. So you can see the big difference of how do we get from 667,000 to 639,000 in 2 years. It doesn't seem very realistic. How do we lose 15,000 housing units from what they estimated in 2019? One of the things we did notice that cities in Michigan that had the lowest census response rates also lost population. So Detroit and Flint particularly, with the lowest response rates in the state, also had the largest population loss. In the city, all of Detroit's population loss was African-American, which is different than in years past. But all of that, there were about 93,000 people, they estimate, African-American, who left the city. Now, I say all that because given the bleak numbers, these population numbers, it wasn't for lack of trying. So I just wanted to give you a glimpse of some of the things that we in Detroit and our Detroit Be Counted campaign did to try to get the most robust count we could. So we raised a little over $3 million for this campaign. And this was the city of Detroit, not the US Census Bureau campaign. We spent a little over $1 million on media that included 134 billboards throughout, starting in late 2019, early 2020 through October of 2020. We had digital ads, a huge social media campaign with over 6 million impressions. We produced 35 videos, a lot of them by people who were messengers targeting the the folks that we thought were the hardest to count. So younger people, African Americans, et cetera. We knocked on 444,000 doors in the city of Detroit. That's about every residential door twice. We had a complete count committee and subcommittees. Altogether, over 130 partner organizations participated in this campaign. When the census began in March, we had a kickoff rally planned. It was canceled. And then it was a cascade of cancellations from there. We had over almost 100 events already scheduled on our calendar from March through August. All of those events were canceled, obviously, because of the shutdown, because of the pandemic. So we pivoted to a virtual phone bank and trained our census captains, 110 of them who were going to work these events, to now work the phones. And they ended up making 61,000 phone calls late March through mid-May. We did mailing, so almost 350,000 pieces of mailing we sent out, text messages. We distributed not only through canvassing, but at our different events, almost 730,000 pieces of lit. The other thing is, after all those events were canceled, in May, at the end of May, we started to do events, all outdoor. We ended up holding 187 events. Now, these included in front of grocery stores with tablets, asking people to sign up for the census. This included at schools, back to school events. This included drive-up Sunday services. Being in parks, all the demonstration, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, we were there marching and asking people to sign up for the census. So we ended up in the middle of the pandemic doing 187 events. And I say that because I know that there's been some noise about, how could Detroit's numbers be so bad? What did they do? Well, now you can see that we had one of the most robust campaigns in the entire country. So where are we now? And back in 2010, because of the 250,000 people that the Census Bureau said left the city of Detroit or otherwise were not counted, Detroit back then decided to do an appeal. So they fought the count. So here in 2020, at the end of October, so just 2 weeks after the census officially ended and the enumeration ended, Mayor Duggan and Congresswoman Tlaib did a press conference together and said that back then, when we, months before we knew what the count was going to be, that this count was going to be challenged. And I'm putting this out there because we knew very early on, because of the US Census Bureau's operation in the city of Detroit, the short staffed, the lack of having a census office director for months, the way in which people were trained to be enumerators, on and on and on. We got testimony from people who were census enumerators about the operation in Detroit. And we knew then that we were going to challenge it because of the stories we were hearing from the city, from people who worked in the city as census enumerators, people who knocked on doors to do follow-up. So true to form, the numbers came out in August and showed a huge, at what we considered a much larger census population loss than we anticipated, than anybody really anticipated. And that we can always say that we put as good a faith effort as we could have in terms of making people aware of the census, making the census accessible to them. We signed people up at the doors. We gave gift cards to people, discounts on groceries if they'd sign up, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that we made a good faith effort. But we are convinced that there was an undercount. We were convinced, again, in October of last year that there was going to be an undercount. So here we are. So I just wanted to say a little bit about where we're headed, where we're going. And like Carrie talked about in her presentation, of all the challenges that we faced in this census with the shifting timelines during the pandemic, Detroit was already considered the hardest to count large city in the country going in. And that was because of the combination of poverty, lots of renters who moved, 50% of Detroit's population is rental, people who moved a lot. Also the minority situation we have where more than 80% of the people in the city of Detroit are either African-American or Hispanic or another race or not. So we knew that there was a lot of mistrust going into this census, just had dated back decades and decades that we were going to deal with, that we had to deal with. So all those factors combined to make Detroit already a challenging city before the pandemic. So we know that we have to challenge this count. And the fundamental reason for challenging it for us is, so a loss of roughly 30,000 people in population translates in the city of Detroit to about $150 million in lost revenue for the city of Detroit in terms of federal programs. So as Carrie outlined, a lot of this is around healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid, but it's also food and nutrition programs, it's Head Start, it's children's health insurance. There's just a ton of federal funding that we stand to lose. If we look at roughly $5,000 per person per year for everyone that was either not counted or lost to population, we're looking at $150 million in lost federal funding. So we have tremendous issues at stake here in getting the count reversed. We cannot reverse the redistricting. That's going to be set in stone because the decision on revising population counts, if we're successful, will only affect probably the 2023 and future yearly estimates for federal funding. So we are considering legal action that's going to be outside the normal administrative appeal process, which we're working on now, looking at the testimony received last fall from US Census enumerators and some other things. We are also looking to go administratively. So the census allows you to do 3 types of administrative appeals. One is called the CQR, that's the count question resolution. But the scope of that appeal process is very narrow. So for instance, if you know on a particular census block group that there are missing housing units that the Census Bureau didn't count, you cannot appeal missing housing units under the current rules for the CQR, the count question resolution. You cannot appeal vacant units. So whatever the census says is vacant, you can't appeal, even if you have evidence that these were occupied in 2020 at the time they counted, you cannot appeal that under the current CQR rules. You can appeal if there are boundary issues. So if we have housing units that were counted in Highland Park or Hamtramck, but they're actually located in Detroit, that's the kind of appeal we can make. And there's a few other really small types of ways in which the scope of the CQR might allow you to appeal. The other way is to do a special census. You can actually ask the Census Bureau to recount the population in certain census tracts. That's all that cost of that recount is on the city or the municipality. And finally, you can challenge your annual population estimates. All of these challenges are very difficult given what Corey talked about in terms of differential privacy. So these are the kinds of challenges we face and that we're up against, but we're going to move forward looking at all of these ways because there is so much at stake for the city of Detroit in terms of federal funding and population loss. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Arnold.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and all of you for your great presentations today. Matt, I see we have a few questions both in the chat and the Q&A. One of them is for you, Corey. How do you think the commission will address the criteria that districts cannot favor or disfavor an incumbent while having to add population to each district or cut a district? Do you think the final map will change each district as little and evenly as possible, or will one or two districts be drastically changed? I'm not sure if he's talking about congressional districts or state house or state senate districts, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, well, at least when it comes to US House, I mean, obviously it can't be that each district changes the same because certain districts are going to have to change more. So I think that there's some limitations about how evenly that can be done. The policy says cannot favor or disfavor an incumbent. So I think that question is, how do you operationalize that? And the question would be, how do you say what makes something more favorable or disfavorable? One could argue that even if you make it more Republican, if it's more, someone's going to be, if a Republican representative has a safer district, they might be more likely to get primaried and have a primary opponent. So it's going to be really hard to sort of navigate that. I would just assume that they're not going to change the districts near as much just because of geography on some ways, but when it comes to certain regions, especially with majority minority districts, those are probably going to take priority, and reviewing the Voting Rights Act. So I think that one will take priority and sort of be a necessity. Sort of these districts have to be changed because we're reevaluating how we distribute these communities of interest.
I think you mentioned this previously as well, but one other question is regarding differential privacy. To what extent can data users be confident that the 2020 data is accurate given the Census Bureau's new approach of differential privacy, which was applied to the data?
You want me? I can take that if. So differential privacy, the impact is much clearer at the smaller the level you get. So the more detailed, the smaller the geographic unit. So when it comes to City of Detroit and appeals, I can identify clearly how that would be a problem. But as you aggregate up, the impact is supposed to be minimal. And as you get to these cities, so especially when it comes to state senate and state house districts, it's not really going to change the character of the aggregate overall. It does lead to some confusion where it might create a temptation for someone redistricted a little differently because it seems like there's this district over here that has a lot of population when in fact it doesn't. I've noticed this a little bit in my local areas just based on boundaries of cities that extend into different counties, and the census sort of distributes by the county and by the state or by the city, and then it kind of creates weird, where county lines and city lines cross, it creates weird effects that I don't think are actually in real life. So that's been my own personal impression. I don't think though, when you're looking at an overall city, you have to be that worried about the effects of differential privacy.
Terry, we had a question, a little granular, I think. Someone interested in knowing if there is a way to search for county numbers of mobile homes in Michigan. Is that somewhere part of the census?
I don't know the answer if they've created all the reports on that, and just know I was going to create. This would normally be a bad census joke, but our state demographer, Eric Guthrie, actually moved to Minnesota. But thankfully it was after the census count. But he's the one that keeps all those details, unless Corey knows that one as well.
So if someone was interested in that kind of data, they might want to contact the Office of the State Demographer, right? Yeah.
Yes, they haven't replaced his position yet, but they will be hiring if anyone's interested.
Okay.
But we've also only released a pretty minimal version right now, just population, race, and ethnic data for use in redistricting.
Matt, anything you want to follow up on?
Well, I did want to make sure we get a chance for Victoria to respond to someone was worried about blaming the victims. Should we update the count to accommodate how people live versus consider it an issue of the people who are being counted?
I would just say that, particularly in rental housing, I mean, the reality is that during the pandemic, those multiple family dwellings were very minimally, if at all, enumerated. And because the fluidity of people's housing situations, filling out a census form, receiving a census form in the mail is, a dicey proposition. That is, you generally don't, and the way the mail delivery was, all of those efforts, all of those things that will allow people, especially in apartment buildings, to access the census was very difficult. And that's just the way the census counts people, either by mail, phone, or online. And each one of those things, especially during the pandemic, the follow-up enumeration to those places was extremely challenging. Apartment building owners and managers were not letting people go up and down halls in the middle of COVID to count people and knock on their doors. So it's not about blaming the victim. It's just about the housing, the particular housing situations, and a process like the census. It just makes it very challenging to be counted. And our efforts obviously didn't go far enough, and certainly neither did the Census Bureaus.
I want to just piggyback because I want to recognize, Vicki on this point, pre-pandemic, the city of Detroit, I think, was the only community actually reaching out to the owners, the developers of these multi-unit housing, trying to prepare a plan, for the census. So I think it was, again, just another place where the city of Detroit was really trying to innovate and get ahead of any challenges that we would face in a normal census. And unfortunately, things just grew from the pandemic.
I'll also ask my parochial question, which is that April 2020, when this census was supposed to be recording who was where, was also when a bunch of universities sent home students from in-person classes. There were some areas in East Lansing as well as around Central Michigan University that looked like they might have been places where students normally are, but maybe weren't in April 2020. I know that there were some efforts to correctly count the dorms, but maybe not the off-campus housing. Anything you can tell us about that, Carrie?
Yeah, we were definitely, working with our colleges and universities, recognizing and working with them to the local complete count committees as well to say, listen, this is going to be a problem. And you own your student information. So if there's ways and a willingness to do any type of outreach, whether that's through email, through texting, through their own program, knowing they're not going to want to share that information with us, that, that's kind of what we implored them to, determine some strategies around that. We, of course, did our own kind of data collection through commercial vendors to try to get cell phones for those apartment complexes and geofence, digital ads, and all that good stuff to try to, again, and then also, of course, messaging, connect that to, how it impacts, college student lives as well, and financial aid and all that good stuff.
And can we maybe, Victoria, localize some of the impacts that a lower than actual population count in Detroit would mean for social service provision and money going to local areas. Carrie gave us the overall state numbers, but I was wondering if we can get a sense of if the count was 5 or 10% lower than the actual number of people, what that's going to mean in terms of the resources for the city and access to services.
Well, I think I mentioned in my presentation, I mean, that's the fundamental push behind the challenge, which is if we estimated, looking at all the programs that are impacted by census population counts in terms of how the feds distribute money. And with the state demographer came up with a figure of $5,000 per person per year. So if we lost nearly 30,000 people from 2010 to 2020, and it times 5,000 per person per year. I'm not a mathematician, but it seems like that amounts to about $150 million in federal funding per person per year, given that loss of population. And it's going to have the most impact on healthcare funding from the feds and food and nutrition programs. Those are probably the two types of programs that are most dependent on census population numbers.
And anything we want to say about Flint? Obviously lost a huge percentage of its population. We know went through the Flint water crisis during the period between the censuses. It does seem like a horrible time to be losing resources, even though that's the way that the census is set up to measure. We say anything about that, Carrie?
Yeah, I would, I think that's an interesting, point as it relates to, this is how it's built in terms of how federal funding works. The census is baked into our United States Constitution, just as the redistricting commission and the criteria around it is now baked into our state constitution. And I would just say that, I think, we have to be realists too, and some of the challenges that communities have faced, and there has been some population loss in areas. And, I know that they too were running a very robust operation between the local nonprofits in the Flint, Genesee County area, as well as their local government with their local complete count committees. So it was definitely not running a program outside of the typical U.S. Census Bureau outreach. And I know that there are a number of communities across the state that are reflecting on what their options may be, even recognizing that challenging your census count is a challenging equation. But I think that, again, this is why it's important to keep this on the radar screen, and because these dollars into our states and communities are critical to the health of our communities. And why, probably for a while, folks were probably annoyed with some of the census ads that we were putting up, but it's only because of the importance and how critical it is to some core essential services.
Corey, you mentioned the changes in the way that we ask the race and ethnicity questions. Can you talk a little bit more about that? We saw all these headlines that said that there's more multi-race people, and there's more people identifying as other race. That seems likely to be true, even if we didn't change the way we ask it. But it could be that part of that is measurement changes in measurement. So how did we deal with that last time when they also changed the form, and how is that likely to impact things going forward?
Yeah, well, before, actually, I think it was the Lansing metro area that had the largest per capita multiracial kids across the country. So it would not be surprising if Michigan scored highly on some of those metrics, especially with the change in the form. So that wasn't necessarily surprising. We also have an issue with Arab Americans. Arab is not considered a racial category, and then where do you put yourself on those forms? And then when you have multiple options, how do you check yourself? I think that's given that we have some significant populations with those communities, that fall into those categories, that change in form probably was highly impactful. I would say that's interesting is that, so what we found then is that, white population decline, African-American population stayed somewhat similar, and then multi-categories increased about 100, 200%, but that was nationwide. So I haven't really looked at the data whether our increase was larger than other states or whatnot. But some communities in Michigan were fairly high on that metric already. I just think that the issue is going to be is how do you then go back and say, this is the population I need to get a candidate of this ethnic group to emerge as the winner. And then how do you now look at the census data where you're using completely different form? Are you going to try to just look at white only or some category like that? You kind of have to change how your baseline metric. So it's up to the redistricting commission.
We also got another question about whether the census collection system is just broken, mentioning phones and mailing as outdated systems. I know we tried to adapt, but any sense of lessons learned from this time that can be applied next time?
I'll take a stab at that, but Carrie, I'm sorry, you could too. This was the first online census. So for a city that has one of the lowest percentages of people with a regular internet connection, obviously it's a challenge. Most cities, the majority of their responses were through online. We had the highest mail-in response, but I do think I think there needs to be some adjustment. And there needs to be obviously a greater, if the census is going to do an online going forward, which I have every expectation that they will, the federal government needs to make more of an investment in poor urban and rural communities in expanding internet access for folks. Because just to say, oh, we're going to do it online without that kind of investment prior to the census, I think put us and other cities across the country in a really, really difficult situation. And part of the reason for the low response rate, I think, was directly related to that. Mail is just going to have to be always a part of it. I do think the phones, given how the actual operation of the phone bank or the phone hotline worked, was pretty much a waste of time. But so they might have to rethink that. But the internet response is here to stay, that's for sure. And we need a lot more work to make a much greater investment in that.
Is the next session, Matt, ARP funds and our federal investment into our communities and how we build that infrastructure and broadband access up?
We have done some of that and we'll continue to follow it. So we also had a form on the census before the census took place, and two of the things that folks mentioned from the pre-census surveys were fear that there would be low Hispanic participation for fear of immigration enforcement or something related to that, and fear of low responses by rural conservative voters with more anti-government attitudes. Did we see any signs of either of those, or do we know?
I don't believe there's any evidence on the Hispanic from Michigan, at least. I would also just like to go back to I would also point out that the census has tried to propose different approaches, but the Supreme Court has decided that the Constitution will not allow it. So there was a proposal to use more of a sampling mechanism, but the ruling of the Supreme Court is that a census requires an actual hard count. And I'm not going to get into the whole details about the census has in some ways is limited in what it can do based on what's listed in the Constitution, and good luck changing the Constitution. So, in terms of the rural voters, I don't know. Just beyond sort of looking, who knows what's population decline and what's non-response.
All right, well, it's now time for last thoughts, closing statements, any action items that we can leave folks with. We'll go in the same order as the panel. So Carrie's up first again.
Action items. Well, the next census, 2030, put it on the calendar. It's important to our state, I think. And then launching off, I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the investment into the critical infrastructure and programs that the census helps inform in terms of funding into our communities. But I would just say political representation. Again, and we've tapped on the redistricting piece and the commission and that active dialogue that is now in our state constitution. I think any action step would be to participate in that process as well, because again, this is all core to our democracy.
Thanks, Corey. Any last thoughts?
No, I mean, I'll be watching this commission. I think I would just, your action item is to be sympathetic to these individuals.
Yes, tomorrow they'll be on MSU's campus. Victoria, last thoughts.
Well, I would say that for folks on this call, this Zoom meeting, to take a look at those redistricting maps and participate in any opportunity to comment on them. And I think it's all of our responsibility, whether it's the census, whether it's voting, whether it's vaccines, that people in the poorest communities, it just takes hard work to reach out to them and overcome those barriers. And so I think it's all of our responsibility to make sure, whether you work for a nonprofit or for government or for the private sector, to know that and to really commit to making sure people aren't left behind.
Thank you. That's good thought to end on. As a reminder, the next forum is scheduled for October 19th. That's a Tuesday, then November 17th and December 15th. You can get those on your schedule so that you can hear more about economic development incentives, learning loss during the pandemic, and Carrie's charged us with more. You can also see our old forums, including the one on expenditure of resources from the federal stimulus bill, on our website, and you can still apply for the Michigan Political Leadership Program, all at ippsr.msu.edu. Thanks so much for joining us.